The rain had been falling steadily for 2 hours, turning the city streets into a maze of puddles and reflections. Robert Davidson pulled his black sedan into the small parking lot behind Antonio's restaurant, one of those family-owned places that had somehow survived in a neighborhood where everything else seemed to change every few months. He sat in his car for a moment, watching the raindrops race down his windshield, wondering if this was really where he wanted to spend his evening. At 62 years old, Robert had more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. His technology company had revolutionized how people communicated across the globe, making him one of the wealthiest men in the country. But wealth, he had learned, came with its own set of problems. Every restaurant he usually visited knew who he was. Every conversation felt calculated. Every smile seemed to have a price tag attached to it. Tonight was different. Tonight, he just wanted to disappear. The meeting with his board of directors had gone worse than expected. They wanted him to cut costs, which meant laying off thousands of employees just to make the quarterly numbers look better. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet to Robert. These were real people with families, mortgages, and dreams. People who had helped build his company from the ground up. The thought of destroying their lives for the sake of profit made his stomach turn. He stepped out of his car and immediately felt the cool evening air hit his face. It was refreshing after spending the entire day in air-conditioned boardrooms and office buildings. The restaurant's neon sign flickered slightly, casting a warm red glow across the wet pavement. Through the large windows, he could see families gathered around tables, sharing meals and conversations. It looked so normal, so peaceful. The bell above the door chimed softly as Robert entered. The smell of garlic, tomatoes, and fresh bread immediately filled his senses. It reminded him of his childhood when his grandmother would cook Sunday dinners for the entire family. Back then, money was tight, but somehow those meals felt richer than any expensive dinner he had eaten in the past decade. The restaurant was busier than he expected for a Tuesday evening. Almost every table was occupied by families, couples, and groups of friends. The walls were covered with old photographs of the neighborhood, pictures of regular customers, and handwritten thank you notes from children. A small stage in the corner held an old upright piano that looked like it hadn't been tuned in years. Robert chose a corner booth, where he could observe without being noticed. He was wearing a simple gray sweater and jeans, nothing that would identify him as someone worth billions of dollars. For the first time in months, he felt anonymous. No one was staring at him, trying to get his attention, or positioning themselves for a conversation that might lead to a business opportunity. The menu was simple and honest. No fancy descriptions or exotic ingredients. Just good, traditional Italian food at prices that working families could afford. Robert smiled as he read it. When was the last time he had eaten somewhere that didn't require a reservation weeks in advance? As he looked around the restaurant, Robert began to notice the small details that made this place special. An elderly couple at a nearby table was celebrating their anniversary, judging by the small cake the staff had brought out. A group of teenagers in the center of the room was clearly on some kind of double date, the boys nervous and the girls giggling at everything they said. Near the window, a father was patiently teaching his young daughter how to use chopsticks, even though they were eating spaghetti. But it was the staff that really caught Robert's attention. Unlike the polished, professional servers at upscale restaurants, these people seemed genuinely happy to be there. They laughed with customers, remembered names, and treated everyone like family. There was something authentic about their interactions that Robert hadn't experienced in years. The waitress who approached his table embodied everything he had noticed about this place. She was probably in her late 20s, with kind eyes and a smile that reached all the way to her face. Her uniform was clean but showed signs of a long day's work. Despite what must have been exhaustion from being on her feet for hours, she moved with grace and purpose. "Good evening," she said warmly. "Welcome to Antonio's. My name is Lisa, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Robert ordered a simple coffee and asked for a few more minutes to look at the menu. As Lisa walked away, he noticed something that made him pause. At the staff counter near the kitchen, a young boy sat quietly doing homework. He appeared to be around 7 or 8 years old, and Robert could see the family resemblance immediately. This had to be Lisa's son. The boy was different from the other children in the restaurant. He sat in a small wheelchair, and Robert could see leg braces beneath his school uniform. But what struck Robert most was the child's focus and determination. While other kids his age would probably be running around or playing games on a phone, this boy was concentrating intently on his schoolwork, occasionally looking up to wave at his mother as she passed by. The relationship between mother and son was beautiful to watch. Every few minutes, Lisa would find a moment between serving customers to check on her boy. She would ruffle his hair, ask about his homework, or bring him a small snack. The love between them was obvious and pure, untainted by the complications that seemed to follow Robert everywhere he went. As the evening progressed, Robert found himself more interested in observing this family than in his own meal. He watched how Lisa handled difficult customers with patience and grace. He saw how she went out of her way to make sure an elderly man got extra attention because he seemed lonely. He noticed how she cleaned up after other people's children without complaint. Even when their parents weren't watching, this woman was working incredibly hard, probably making very little money, and yet she approached every interaction with genuine kindness. Robert had employed thousands of people over the years, but he couldn't remember the last time he had seen someone take such pride in what many would consider a simple job. The boy, meanwhile, had finished his homework and was now reading a thick book that looked far too advanced for someone his age. Every so often, he would glance toward the old piano in the corner with a look of longing that Robert recognized immediately. It was the same way he had looked at computers as a child, when they were still mysterious machines that seemed capable of magic. The restaurant continued to buzz with activity around them. Families finished their meals and said goodbye to servers who had probably known them for years. New customers arrived and were greeted like old friends. The whole place felt like a community, something Robert realized he had been missing from his own life for far too long. As he sat in that corner booth, sipping his coffee and watching this ordinary Tuesday evening unfold, Robert began to feel something he hadn't experienced in months: peace. For the first time since the board meeting, his mind wasn't racing with problems to solve or decisions to make. He was simply present, enjoying the warmth and humanity of this little restaurant that felt like a world away from his usual life. Lisa Rodriguez had been on her feet for nearly 6 hours, but her smile never wavered. This was her second job of the day, and she still had 3 more hours to go before she could take her son Tommy home. Her first job at the medical clinic ended at 2 in the afternoon, giving her just enough time to pick up Tommy from school and bring him to the restaurant, where he would wait patiently while she worked the evening shift. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the life she had, and she was determined to make the best of it. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency, refilling coffee cups, taking orders, and making small talk with regulars who had become like extended family over the past 2 years. Mrs. Chun always ordered the same thing: chicken parmesan with extra sauce. The Williams family came in every Tuesday because it was their youngest daughter's favorite restaurant. Old Mr. Peterson sat at table 12 every evening, ordering just coffee and pie. But Lisa knew he came more for the company than the food. Each customer had a story, and Lisa remembered them all. She had learned that good service wasn't just about bringing food quickly. It was about making people feel seen, heard, and welcome. In a world that often felt cold and rushed, Antonio's restaurant was a place where people could slow down and feel human again, but tonight felt different. There was a quiet man in the corner booth who had been watching everything with unusual interest. He wasn't rude or demanding like some customers could be. Instead, he seemed genuinely curious about how the restaurant worked, how the staff interacted with customers, and especially how she cared for Tommy. Tommy was the center of Lisa's universe. At 8 years old, he was smarter than most adults she knew, but his body hadn't been as kind to him as his mind. He had been born with spina bifida, a condition that affected his spine and legs. The doctors had told her he would never walk, But Tommy had surprised everyone by learning to get around with leg braces and determination that amazed even his physical therapist. The wheelchair was necessary for longer distances, and when he got tired, but Tommy refused to let it define him. He was curious about everything, asked questions that sometimes stumped college professors, and had a way of finding joy in the smallest things. Most importantly, he never complained, even when Lisa knew he was in pain or frustrated by the limitations his condition placed on him. Tonight, like every night, Tommy had finished his homework within the first hour of arriving at the restaurant. His teachers had stopped giving him grade-level work months ago, because he completed it too quickly and seemed bored by the simple assignments. Instead, they had started giving him books and projects meant for children several years older. Lisa watched him from across the restaurant as she served the businessman his second cup of coffee. Tommy was reading a book about classical composers, completely absorbed in the stories of Mozart, Beethoven, and Bach. Music had become his passion over the past year, ever since he had discovered videos of piano performances on the old tablet Lisa had managed to buy him for his birthday. The tablet had been a huge purchase for their tight budget, but seeing Tommy's face light up when he watched those performances made every extra hour of work worth it. He would sit for hours watching the same videos over and over, studying how the pianists moved their hands, memorizing the melodies, and dreaming of the day he might be able to play like that. Lisa had found him once, late at night, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands positioned as if he were playing piano keys that weren't there. He was moving his fingers along with the video, perfectly matching the rhythm and flow of the piece. When she asked what he was doing, he had looked up with those bright eyes and said, "I'm practicing, Mom. One day I'm going to play real piano." The memory made her heart ache with a mixture of pride and sadness. Tommy's dreams were so big, but their reality was so limited. Piano lessons cost more than their monthly grocery budget. Even if they could afford lessons, most music schools weren't equipped to work with children who had physical challenges. The few programs that existed had waiting lists that stretched for years, but Tommy never gave up hope. He had taught himself to read music by watching YouTube videos and studying library books. He could identify complex classical pieces just by hearing a few notes. When they passed music stores, he would press his face against the windows, staring at the pianos with the same wonder other kids reserved for toy stores. Lisa had tried to save money for lessons, setting aside a few dollars each week when she could. But between Tommy's medical bills, his special equipment, and their basic living expenses, there was never enough left over. His leg braces needed to be replaced every year as he grew. His medications were expensive even with insurance. The Specialized wheelchair had cost more than Lisa made in 3 months. Still, she refused to give up on Tommy's dreams. If she couldn't afford piano lessons, she would find other ways to nurture his musical gifts. She borrowed music books from the library, downloaded free piano apps on the tablet, and encouraged him to keep practicing his finger exercises even without a real piano. The other staff members at Antonio's had grown to love Tommy almost as much as Lisa did. Maria, the head cook, always made sure he had his favorite snacks during the evening shift. Frank, the manager, let him use the small office to do homework when the restaurant got too noisy. Even the other servers would stop by his table to chat and check on him throughout their shifts. Tommy brought out the best in everyone he met. There was something about his combination of intelligence, determination, and pure joy that made people want to help him succeed. He never asked for pity or special treatment, but his genuine kindness and curiosity made him impossible not to love. Lisa had noticed that the quiet man in the corner booth had been watching Tommy for most of the evening. At first she worried that he might be annoyed by having a child in the restaurant. Some customers complained about kids even when they were as well behaved as Tommy, but this man seemed different. His expression wasn't one of annoyance, but rather of genuine interest and perhaps even admiration. As the evening wore on, Lisa found herself stealing glances at both the mysterious customer and her son. Tommy had finished his book and was now drawing in his notebook, probably sketching the piano keyboard he had memorized from his videos. His concentration was absolute, the tip of his tongue poking out slightly as he worked to get every detail perfect. The businessman had ordered a simple dinner but seemed more interested in watching the restaurant's rhythm than eating his food. Lisa had served hundreds of customers and she had learned to read people quickly. This man was different from their usual crowd. Everything about him suggested he came from money. His clothes were expensive but understated. His watch was probably worth more than she made in a year, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from never having to worry about basic necessities. Yet, he didn't seem to be slumming or looking down on the working-class restaurant. Instead, he appeared genuinely moved by what he was witnessing. Lisa wondered what had brought him to Antonio's tonight, and why he seemed so interested in her small family's evening routine. The evening rush was finally slowing down when Tommy looked up from his drawing and noticed something he had seen 100 times before but never really paid attention to. In the corner of the restaurant, partly hidden behind a dusty silk plant, sat an old upright piano. The dark wood was scratched and worn, and sheet music from what looked like the 1980s still sat on the music stand. Yellowed with age. Tommy had always known the piano was there, but tonight it seemed to be calling to him. Maybe it was because he had spent the last hour sketching piano keys in his notebook, or maybe it was because the restaurant was quieter than usual. But suddenly he couldn't take his eyes off the instrument. He wheeled his chair closer to get a better look. The piano bench was wooden and appeared sturdy enough to support him, though he would need help getting from his wheelchair to the seat. His heart started beating faster as he imagined what it would feel like to finally touch real piano keys. Instead of the flat surface of his tablet screen, Lisa was wiping down tables on the other side of the restaurant when she noticed Tommy had moved from his usual spot. She looked over to see him staring at the old piano with an expression she recognized immediately. It was the same look he got when they passed music stores, the same longing she had seen in his eyes for months whenever anything musical came into view. She walked over to him, drying her hands on her apron. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" Tommy looked up at his mother with those bright, hopeful eyes that could melt her heart in an instant. "Mom, do you think I could try playing it, just for a minute?" Lisa's first instinct was to say no. The piano belonged to the restaurant, and she wasn't sure if customers or staff were allowed to use it. Frank, the manager, was pretty strict about keeping things professional during business hours. Plus, there were still customers in the restaurant, including that quiet businessman who had been watching them all evening. But as she looked at Tommy's face, she remembered all the times she had found him practicing on invisible keys, all the hours he had spent studying music videos, all the dreams he had shared with her about someday playing real piano. How could she say no to something he wanted so badly? "I don't know, honey," she said softly. "There are still people eating, and I'm not sure if Mr. Antonio would want us using the piano during dinner service." Tommy's face fell slightly, but he nodded with the same mature acceptance he showed whenever reality interfered with his wishes. "That's okay, Mom, I understand." Lisa felt her heart break a little. Here was her 8-year-old son, facing disappointment with more grace than most adults could manage. She looked around the restaurant. There were only a few tables still occupied, and most of those customers were finishing up their meals. The piano was in a corner where it wouldn't disturb anyone too much. Before she could change her mind, she walked over to Frank, who was counting receipts behind the counter. "Frank," she said quietly, "would it be okay if Tommy played the piano for just a few minutes? I know it's not usually allowed, but he's been teaching himself music, and he's never had a chance to try a real piano." Frank looked up from his paperwork and glanced over at Tommy, who was still sitting by the piano, running his fingers along the wheelchair's armrest as if he were playing invisible keys. Frank had a soft spot for the boy who had never caused any trouble and always thanked the staff for letting him do his homework at the restaurant. "I guess it would be okay," Frank said after a moment. "Just keep it quiet and not too long. We still have customers." Lisa felt a rush of gratitude and excitement. She hurried back to Tommy, who was still staring at the piano with that wistful expression. "Good news," she whispered. "Frank said you can try it, but just for a few minutes, and you have to keep it soft so you don't disturb the other customers." Tommy's entire face lit up like Christmas morning. Really? Really, Mom? Lisa nodded, and Tommy immediately started wheeling himself closer to the piano bench. Lisa realized he would need help getting positioned, since his legs couldn't support his weight for more than a few seconds at a time. "Okay, let me help you up," she said, carefully lifting Tommy from his wheelchair. He was small for his age, made even lighter by the muscle weakness in his legs, so it wasn't difficult for Lisa to transfer him to the piano bench. She positioned his leg braces so they wouldn't get in the way and made sure he was sitting securely. "Are you comfortable?" she asked. Tommy nodded, but his attention was already completely focused on the keyboard in front of him. He placed his hands gently on the keys, not pressing down yet, just feeling the smooth surface he had dreamed about touching for so long. Robert, who had been watching this entire exchange from his corner booth, found himself leaning forward with interest. There was something about the care and tenderness between mother and son that reminded him of his own childhood, when his grandmother had first introduced him to the computer that would change his life. Tommy took a deep breath and pressed down. On middle C, the note rang out clear and true, filling the small restaurant with a sound that seemed to make everything else fade into the background. Tommy's eyes closed for a moment, as if he were savoring the experience of finally hearing a real piano note that he had created himself. Then, without any warm-up or practice scales, Tommy began to play. The melody that flowed from his fingers was nothing like what anyone in the restaurant expected. This wasn't Chopsticks or Mary Had a Little Lamb. This was Chopin's Minute Waltz, played with a precision and emotion that seemed impossible from someone who had never touched a real piano before. Robert nearly dropped his coffee cup. He had heard this piece performed by world-class pianists at Lincoln Center, but there was something about hearing it played by this 8-year-old boy in a neighborhood restaurant that made it sound completely new and magical. Lisa stood beside the piano bench, her hand over her mouth in amazement. She had known Tommy was smart, and she had seen his passion for music, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. Her son wasn't just playing the piano, he was bringing it to life. The other customers in the restaurant began to notice as, well, conversations grew quieter, then stopped altogether. Mrs. Chun paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. The Williams family stopped discussing their plans for the weekend. Old Mr. Peterson set down his coffee cup and turned his full attention to the corner, where this small boy was creating something beautiful. Tommy's fingers moved across the keys with confidence and grace, as if he had been playing this particular piano for years instead of seconds. Every note was perfectly placed, every phrase shaped with an understanding of the music that went far beyond his 8 years. The piece built to its climactic section, and Tommy's playing became more passionate, more intense. His small body swayed slightly with the rhythm, completely lost in the music he was creating. For those few minutes, his physical limitations disappeared entirely. At the piano, he wasn't a boy who needed leg braces and a wheelchair. He was simply a musician, sharing his gift with anyone willing to listen. As the final notes of the waltz faded into silence, the restaurant remained completely quiet for several long seconds. Then slowly the applause began. The applause that filled Antonio's restaurant was unlike anything the small establishment had ever experienced. It wasn't just polite clapping from customers who felt obligated to acknowledge a child's effort. This was genuine, heartfelt appreciation for something truly extraordinary they had just witnessed. Mrs. Chun was the first to stand up, her hands coming together in enthusiastic applause. "Beautiful," she called out in accented English. So beautiful. Her eyes were actually wet with tears, and she reached for her napkin to dab them away. The Williams family joined in immediately, their teenage daughter pulling out her phone to record what she hoped might be an encore performance. "Dad, did you hear that?" she whispered excitedly. "He's like really professional level." Old Mr. Peterson, who had been coming to this restaurant for 3 years and rarely spoke to anyone, beyond ordering his coffee and pie, slowly rose from his seat and began walking toward the piano. His weathered hands shook slightly as he clapped, and when he reached Tommy, he leaned down with a smile that transformed his usually stern face. "Young man," he said in a voice thick with emotion, "that was the most beautiful thing I've heard." In 40 years, my late wife used to play that exact piece. He paused, struggling with his words. You just brought her back to me for a few minutes. Tommy looked up at the elderly man with wide eyes, not fully understanding the impact of what he had just done, but sensing the deep emotion in Mr. Peterson's voice. Thank you, sir, he said softly. I hope I played it the way she would have liked. Mr. Peterson nodded and gently patted Tommy's shoulder before returning to his table, where he sat quietly, lost in memories that the music had awakened. Lisa stood beside the piano bench, still in shock. She had known Tommy was special, had seen his passion and dedication, but this performance had revealed a level of talent she hadn't fully understood. Her son hadn't just played the piano, he had transformed the entire atmosphere of the restaurant. With his music, Robert remained in his corner booth, but his mind was racing. He had attended countless charity galas and cultural events where professional musicians performed. He had donated millions to music education programs and sat through board meetings for several arts organizations. But he had never been as moved by a performance as he was by what this 8-year-old boy had just accomplished. The technical skill was impressive enough, but there was something more. Tommy had played with genuine emotion, with an understanding of the music that went far beyond mere finger exercises and memorized notes. There was artistry in his performance, the kind of natural musicality that couldn't be taught. As the applause began to die down, conversations started up around the restaurant, but now every table was talking about Tommy and his incredible performance. How long has he been playing? One customer asked Lisa. Did he take lessons at the conservatory downtown? Wondered another. I've never heard a child play like that before. Marveled a woman at a nearby table. Lisa found herself answering the same questions over and over, and each time she told Tommy's story, she could hardly believe it herself. He's never had a real lesson, she explained to the gathering crowd. He taught himself everything by watching videos on an old tablet. This revelation made Tommy's performance even more astounding. Parents began looking at their own children with new wonder, imagining what hidden talents might be waiting to be discovered. Several people asked if Tommy performed anywhere else, if there were other opportunities to hear him play. Tommy himself seemed overwhelmed by all the attention. He was still sitting at the piano bench, his small hands resting on the keys, occasionally pressing 1 or 2 notes as if to confirm that this was all really happening. The leg braces that usually made him self-conscious seemed forgotten as people focused entirely on his musical gift. Can you play something else? Asked the Williams daughter, who had now moved closer to the piano with several other customers. Tommy looked to his mother for permission. Lisa hesitated, knowing that Frank had only agreed to a few minutes of playing, but seeing the eager faces around them, she nodded. One more song, she said quietly. Something shorter this time. Tommy's face lit up, and he positioned his hands over the keys again. This time he chose something simpler but no less beautiful, For Elise by Beethoven. It was a piece most people recognized, which made his flawless performance even more impressive to the listening audience. As Tommy played, Robert found himself studying not just the boy, but his mother as well. Lisa's pride was obvious, but there was something else in her expression, worry, maybe, or sadness. Despite the joy of this moment, Robert sensed there was more to their story. When the second piece ended, the applause was even more enthusiastic than before. Several customers approached Lisa directly, asking about Tommy's musical education and whether he performed publicly. We're still figuring all that out, Lisa said diplomatically, not wanting to explain their financial situation. To strangers. Right now, Tommy just loves music for the joy of it. But Robert could read between the lines. A child with this level of talent should be studying with professional teachers, performing in recitals, maybe even competing in youth competitions. The fact that Tommy was entirely self-taught suggested that formal music education wasn't an option for this family. An older gentleman at a corner table, who had introduced himself as a retired music teacher, approached the piano with obvious excitement. Young man, he said to Tommy, I taught piano for 35 years, and I can tell you that what you just did is remarkable. Have you ever thought about taking formal lessons? Tommy's eyes brightened immediately. I would love to take lessons," he said enthusiastically. "I want to learn everything about music. I want to play all the great composers and maybe someday write my own music too." The retired teacher turned to Lisa. "There are several excellent programs in the city. I'd be happy to make some recommendations. A talent like this shouldn't go undeveloped." Lisa smiled politely, but Robert noticed how her expression tightened slightly. "Thank you so much," she said. "That's very kind of you to offer." The teacher continued, not sensing Lisa's discomfort. "The Community Music Center downtown has a wonderful program. It's only about $200 a month, and they provide the piano practice time too. For a child with Tommy's natural ability, it would be perfect. $200 a month." Robert watched Lisa's face as she processed this information. For him, that amount was meaningless, less than he spent on a single lunch at his usual restaurants. But for a waitress working multiple jobs to support a child with medical needs, $200 might as well be $2,000. "We'll definitely look into it," Lisa said, her voice still warm but now carrying a note of finality that suggested the conversation was over. The retired teacher handed her a business card anyway. "Please don't wait too long," he said earnestly. "Natural talent like Tommy's is rare, but it needs proper guidance to reach its full potential." As the crowd around the piano began to disperse and customers returned to their tables, Robert remained focused on the small family. Tommy was carefully transferring himself back to his wheelchair with Lisa's help, his face still glowing with the excitement of having played a real piano for the first time, but Robert could see the weight that had settled on Lisa's shoulders. The generous offers of help and advice from well-meaning customers had only highlighted what she couldn't provide for her son. The gap between Tommy's extraordinary talent and their limited resources had never been more obvious or more painful. The warm glow that had filled Antonio's restaurant was suddenly interrupted by the sharp sound of papers being slapped down on the front counter. Frank Morelli, the restaurant manager, stood behind the register with his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on the crowd that had gathered around the piano. For the past 15 minutes, Frank had watched his carefully controlled dinner service turn into what he saw as chaos. Customers were out of their seats, walking around, talking loudly, and worst of all, completely ignoring their meals while they focused on the impromptu piano performance. In his mind, this wasn't a beautiful moment of discovery. It was a disruption that was bad for business. Frank was a man who lived by rules and routine. He had been managing restaurants for 22 years, and he believed that successful establishments maintained clear boundaries between staff and customers, between work time and personal time. What he was witnessing violated every principle. He held about professional service. He had given Lisa permission for Tommy to play for a few minutes and quietly. Instead, the boy had performed 2 full pieces, drawn a crowd, and turned the restaurant into some kind of amateur concert hall. In Frank's experience, when you gave people an inch, they took a mile, and this situation was already way beyond what he had agreed to, making matters worse. Frank had noticed that several tables had stopped ordering dessert or additional drinks because they were too busy listening to the music. The Williams family had been looking at the dessert menu when the piano playing started, but now they seemed content to just sit and listen. Mrs. Chun had finished her meal 20 minutes ago, but hadn't asked for her check, because she was caught up in the musical moment. From a business perspective, Frank saw this as lost revenue. Every minute customers spent listening to piano music instead of ordering was money out of the restaurant's pocket. And as the manager, Frank was held accountable for the nightly sales numbers by Mr. Antonio, the owner who came in every morning to review the previous day's receipts. The breaking point came when Frank noticed that the noise level had drawn attention. From outside, a few people walking by had stopped to peer through the windows, and one family had actually come inside just to see what was happening. While this might seem like good publicity, Frank saw it as potential trouble. What if these people expected live music every night? What if word spread that Antonio's was some kind of venue for performances? He couldn't have customers coming in with expectations that he couldn't meet. Frank straightened his tie and walked purposefully across the restaurant toward the piano. His footsteps were heavy and deliberate, cutting through the gentle conversations that had continued after Tommy's performance. Several customers looked up as he approached, sensing the shift in energy. Lisa noticed Frank's approach immediately. She had been helping Tommy adjust his position in the wheelchair, still glowing with pride from her son's incredible performance. But one look at Frank's expression told her that trouble was coming. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the stern, disapproving look she had seen him wear when dealing with problem customers or employees who had made mistakes. "Lisa," Frank said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "I need to speak with you, now." The conversations around the piano area began to quiet down as people sensed tension. Tommy looked up from his wheelchair, his face still bright with excitement from playing, but beginning to show confusion at the serious tone in Frank's voice. "Of course, Frank," Lisa said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "What can I do for you?" Frank crossed his arms and looked down at her with obvious annoyance. "I told you a few minutes of quiet playing. This," he gestured toward the piano and the lingering crowd of customers, "this is not what we discussed." Lisa felt her face flush with embarrassment. Several customers were clearly listening to the conversation, and she could see sympathy and concern in their expressions. "I'm sorry, Frank. Tommy just played 2 songs and people seemed to enjoy—" "I don't care if people enjoyed it," Frank interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "This is a restaurant, not a concert hall. We have customers trying to eat their dinner, and instead they're getting some kind of amateur show that nobody asked for." The harshness of his words hit Lisa like a physical blow. She glanced at Tommy, who was now looking between his mother and Frank with growing worry. The joy that had been shining in her son's eyes was beginning to fade, replaced by the familiar expression of a child who was starting to understand that he had somehow caused trouble. Old Mr. Peterson, who was still sitting at his nearby table, cleared his throat loudly. "Actually, sir, I think most of us very much enjoyed the music. The boy is remarkably talented." Frank turned toward Mr. Peterson with barely controlled irritation. "Sir, I appreciate your opinion, but I have a business to run here. This kind of disruption affects our service quality and our other customers' dining experience." "What disruption?" asked Mrs. Chun, who had also been listening. The music was beautiful. "It made my dinner even more special." But Frank was beyond reasoning with customer opinions. In his mind, he had been too lenient, and now he was dealing with the consequences. He turned back to Lisa with a look that made her heart sink. "This is exactly what I was worried about," he said firmly. "I give you permission for one simple request, and it turns into a whole production. This is why we have policies about personal activities during work hours." Lisa felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she fought to keep them back. "Frank, please, I'm sorry if it went longer than expected. It won't happen again." "You're right, it won't happen again," Frank said, his voice now loud enough that everyone in the restaurant could hear. "Because if you can't control your kid and keep personal stuff separate from work, then maybe you need to find childcare arrangements that don't interfere with your job performance." The words hung in the air like a threat. Lisa knew exactly what Frank was implying. If she couldn't keep Tommy quiet and invisible during her shifts, she would need to find somewhere else for him to stay. But there was nowhere else. She couldn't afford aftercare programs or babysitters. Bringing Tommy to work was her only option, and Frank knew it. "I understand," Lisa said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It won't happen again." Tommy had been listening to this entire exchange with growing distress. He understood enough to know that his piano playing had gotten his mother in trouble, and the weight of that realization was crushing his 8-year-old heart. "Mom," he said softly, reaching for her hand. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause problems." The sight of her son apologizing for sharing his extraordinary gift was more than Lisa could bear. Here was a child who had just revealed incredible talent, who had brought joy and wonder to everyone around him. And now he was apologizing for it because it had put her job at risk. "It's not your fault, sweetheart," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "You played beautifully. I'm so proud of you." Frank, meanwhile, was already walking back toward the front counter, considering the conversation closed. He had made his point, re-established his authority, and put an end to what he saw as unprofessional behavior. In his mind, he had handled the situation appropriately, but Robert had been watching this entire exchange from his corner booth, and what he had witnessed filled him with a quiet anger that was building steadily. He had seen a talented child's moment of joy crushed by petty authority. He had watched a hard-working mother humiliated for supporting her son's gift, and he had observed a manager who was so focused on arbitrary rules that he couldn't recognize something truly special when it was happening right in front of him. Robert had been watching the entire confrontation unfold from his corner booth, and with each word that came out of Frank's mouth, he felt his anger building to a level he rarely experienced. In his 62 years, he had witnessed many examples of people using their small amount of power to crush others, but this particular scene struck him as especially cruel and unnecessary. Here was a child who had just shared an extraordinary gift with everyone around him, bringing joy and wonder to a simple Tuesday evening. Here was a mother who was working multiple jobs to support her son, asking for nothing more than a few minutes of understanding. And here was a manager who was so concerned with maintaining control that he was willing to humiliate them both in front of a room full of people. Robert set down his coffee cup and made a decision that would change several lives forever. He stood up slowly, his tall frame unfolding from the corner booth. Several customers glanced his way, but most were still focused on the aftermath of Frank's outburst. Lisa was bent over Tommy's wheelchair, whispering reassurances to her son, while Frank had returned to his position behind the counter, apparently satisfied that he had handled the situation. Robert walked across the restaurant with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being heard when he spoke. His footsteps were soft but purposeful, and by the time he reached Frank's counter, his presence was commanding enough that the manager looked up from his paperwork. "Excuse me," Robert said in a calm, measured voice. "I'd like to speak with you." For a moment, Frank looked up with barely concealed irritation. The last thing he wanted was another customer questioning his management decisions. "Yes, sir? Is there a problem with your meal?" "Actually, there is a problem," Robert replied, his voice remaining perfectly polite but carrying an undertone that made Frank pay closer attention. "But it's not with the food." Frank's expression shifted slightly. He had been managing restaurants long enough to recognize different types of customers, and something about this man's bearing suggested he wasn't just another regular patron voicing a complaint. "I see," Frank said, setting down his pen. "What can I help you with?" Robert glanced around the restaurant, noting that several tables were still watching the interaction between Lisa and Tommy. Then he looked back at Frank with eyes that had negotiated billion-dollar deals and stared down corporate boards. "I've been sitting over there for the past 2 hours," Robert said quietly, "and I've had the pleasure of witnessing something truly remarkable. That young boy has a gift that most people only dream of possessing. His mother is clearly devoted to supporting him while working incredibly hard to make ends meet. And instead of celebrating what just happened here, you chose to humiliate them both." Frank's posture stiffened. He wasn't used to being challenged by customers, especially not in such a direct manner. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but I have a business to run here. There are policies and procedures that everyone needs to follow." "Policies," Robert repeated, his voice still calm but now carrying a note of steel. "Tell me, what policy exactly was violated by allowing a child to share a moment of beauty with your customers?" "We don't allow personal activities during work hours," Frank replied defensively. "It disrupts the dining experience and affects our service quality." Robert looked around the restaurant again, taking in the faces of the customers who were clearly still moved by Tommy's performance. "Interesting, because from where I was sitting, it looked like your customers were having the dining experience of their lives." Before Frank could respond, Robert continued, "But since you're concerned about business, let me make you a business proposition." Frank raised an eyebrow, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I'd like to cover the cost of your entire evening's revenue," Robert said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. "Whatever you would have made tonight from all your customers, all their meals, drinks, desserts, everything. I'll pay the full amount." Frank stared at him, not quite processing what he had just heard. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me correctly," Robert said. "I'll buy out your entire evening. In exchange, I'd like you to invite that young man to play." One more song for everyone here? Frank's mind was racing. The evening's revenue would be substantial, probably close to $3,000, once all the current customers finished their meals and paid their bills. This was either an elaborate joke or he was dealing with someone who had serious money. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I understand why." "Let me be more direct," Robert interrupted gently. "My name is Robert Davidson. You might have heard of Davidson Technologies." Frank's face went completely pale. Even someone who didn't follow business news closely knew that name. Davidson Technologies was worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and Robert Davidson was one of the wealthiest people in the country. Frank suddenly understood that he wasn't just dealing with an upset customer. He was facing someone who could probably buy his entire restaurant chain without thinking twice about it. "Mr. Davidson," Frank stammered, "I had no idea. I didn't realize." "There's no reason you should have," Robert said calmly. "I'm just another customer tonight. But I'm a customer who recognizes extraordinary talent when I see it, and I'd very much like to hear that young man play again." Frank looked across the restaurant toward Lisa and Tommy. His entire perspective on the evening suddenly shifted. If Robert Davidson wanted to hear the boy play, then the boy would play. More than that, Frank realized he had just publicly embarrassed a family in front of one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. "Of course, Mr. Davidson," Frank said quickly. "Absolutely, whatever you'd like." Robert nodded and pulled out his wallet, removing a business card and what appeared to be a substantial amount of cash. "This should cover tonight's revenue with room to spare," he said, placing the money on the counter. "And here's my card in case you need verification." Frank looked down at the cash. There was easily $5,000 sitting on his counter. And then at the business card with the Davidson Technologies logo. His hands were actually shaking slightly as he picked up the card. "Now," Robert continued, "would you mind asking Lisa and Tommy if they'd be willing to share one more song with us? And this time, let's make sure they know how much everyone here appreciates their gift." Frank nodded rapidly and hurried around the counter toward Lisa and Tommy. His entire demeanor had transformed from authoritarian manager to eager to please. Service provider. Robert watched this transformation with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. It was unfortunate that it took the revelation of his wealth and status to make Frank treat this family with basic human decency, but at least the result would be positive for Lisa and Tommy. As Frank approached the piano area, Robert could see the confusion on Lisa's face. She had just been humiliated by this same man, and now he was returning with what appeared to be a completely different attitude. "Lisa," Frank said, his voice now warm and accommodating, "I owe you and Tommy an apology. I was completely out of line earlier, and I'm very sorry." Lisa stared at him in bewilderment. "Frank, what?" "There's a customer here tonight who was very moved by Tommy's performance," Frank continued, glancing back toward Robert. "He's made a very generous offer to the restaurant, and he's asked if Tommy might be willing to play one more song for everyone." Tommy looked up from his wheelchair, his eyes still showing traces of the hurt from Frank's earlier words. "I can play again?" "Absolutely," Frank said with enthusiasm that seemed completely genuine now. "In fact, I insist. Your music brought something special to our restaurant tonight, and I should have recognized that immediately." Robert remained at the counter, giving the family space to process this sudden change in circumstances. He could see Lisa looking around the restaurant with confusion, trying to understand what had happened to cause such a dramatic shift in Frank's behavior. But Tommy's reaction was pure joy. The disappointment and hurt from minutes earlier melted away as he realized he would get another chance to play the beautiful piano that had captured his heart. Tommy's third performance was even more magical than the first two. Perhaps it was because the earlier confrontation had reminded him how precious these moments were, or maybe it was simply the joy of knowing that his music was truly welcome. This time, whatever the reason, when his fingers touched the keys to play Clair de Lune by Debussy, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The piece was more challenging than what he had played before, with delicate passages that required incredible control and sensitivity. But Tommy navigated every note with the confidence of someone who had spent countless hours studying the music. Even if he had never had the chance to practice it on a real piano until tonight, Lisa stood beside the piano bench, her hand resting gently on Tommy's shoulder, still trying to process everything that had happened in the past few minutes. Frank's complete change in attitude was confusing enough, but there was something about the quiet businessman in the corner that suggested there was more to this story than she understood. As the haunting melody of Claire de Lune filled the restaurant, Lisa found herself thinking about all the times Tommy had hummed this exact piece while doing his homework, or tapped out the rhythm on the kitchen table while she cooked dinner. He had been carrying these beautiful songs inside him for months, with no way to let them out properly until tonight. When the final notes faded away, the applause was even more enthusiastic than before. Several customers were openly crying, moved by the combination of the beautiful music and the story they had witnessed unfold. Mrs. Chun approached the piano with her purse in hand, clearly intending to give Tommy some money, but Lisa gently shook her head. "You're very kind," Lisa said softly, but just listening was gift enough. Old Mr. Peterson stood up again, but this time he walked to the front counter where Frank was standing. "I've been coming here for 3 years," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "and tonight was the most special evening I've ever had in this restaurant." That young man's music brought back memories I thought I had lost forever. As the crowd around the piano began to disperse and customers returned to finishing their meals, Robert approached the small family. Lisa noticed him coming and felt a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. There was something about this man that commanded attention, even when he was trying to be unassuming. "Excuse me," Robert said gently, addressing both Lisa and Tommy. "I hope you don't mind my interrupting, but I wanted to thank you for the most extraordinary musical experience I've had in years." Tommy looked up from his wheelchair with bright eyes. "Thank you for listening, sir. I'm glad you enjoyed it." Robert smiled at the boy's polite response. "I'm Robert," he said, extending his hand to shake Tommy's small one. "And you must be the most talented young musician I've ever had the pleasure to hear." "I'm Tommy," the boy replied, his face lighting up at the compliment. "And this is my mom, Lisa." Robert turned to Lisa with a warm expression. "You must be incredibly proud of him." "Every single day," Lisa said, her voice thick with emotion from the evening's events. "Tommy amazes me with his talent and his determination." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "Would you mind if I sat with you for a few minutes? I'd love to learn more about Tommy's musical journey." Lisa hesitated for a moment, unsure why this stranger was so interested in their story, but something about Robert's genuine manner put her at ease. "Of course," she said. "Let me just let Frank know I'm taking a quick break." When she returned, Robert had pulled up a chair beside Tommy's wheelchair. He was asking the boy about his favorite composers, and Tommy was enthusiastically explaining why he loved Chopin's emotional style and Bach's mathematical precision. "How long have you been playing?" Robert asked. "Well," Tommy said with the serious tone he used when explaining important things, "I've been studying music for about 1.5 years, but tonight was actually the first time I ever played on a real piano." Robert's eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. "The first time? But your technique is so advanced." Tommy's face brightened with pride. "I practiced every day on my tablet, watching videos and following along. Mom got me an app that shows where the keys are, and I practiced finger exercises on the kitchen table." Lisa sat down across from them, watching Robert's face as he processed this information. She could see that he was genuinely impressed, not just being polite. Tommy taught himself to read music too, Lisa added. "We checked out every music book the library had, and he studied them like textbooks." Robert turned his attention to Lisa, his expression growing more serious. "This level of talent and dedication is extraordinary. Has Tommy had any opportunities to study with professional teachers?" Lisa's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced at Tommy before answering. "We're still exploring our options. she said diplomatically, but Robert had spent decades reading people in business negotiations, and he could tell there was more to the story. If you don't mind my asking, what kind of work do you do? I work at a medical clinic during the day, Lisa said, and here at the restaurant in the evenings. Tommy comes with me after school because... She paused, not wanting to go into details about their financial situation. Because childcare is expensive, Robert finished it gently. I understand. Tommy, who had been listening to this conversation with growing awareness, spoke up quietly. Mom works really hard to take care of me. I cost a lot of money because of my legs. The simple honesty of the 8-year-old statement hit Robert harder than any business presentation ever had. Here was a child who understood that his medical needs placed a financial burden on his mother, and instead of feeling sorry for himself, he was grateful for her sacrifices. Tommy has spina bifida, Lisa explained, her voice matter-of-fact but gentle. He needs special equipment, regular doctor visits, medications, and physical therapy. The insurance helps, but there's still a lot that we have to cover ourselves. Robert nodded, beginning to understand the full picture. And music lessons would be ... A luxury we can't afford right now, Lisa finished honestly. The retired teacher who spoke with us earlier mentioned programs that cost $200 a month, which might as well be $2,000 for our budget. But someday, Tommy said hopefully, when Mom doesn't have to work so much, maybe I can take real lessons. I want to learn everything about music. I want to play in concert halls and maybe even write my own songs. Robert looked at this remarkable child, wise beyond his years, talented beyond measure, and dreaming dreams that seemed impossibly out of reach, given his family's circumstances. Then he looked at Lisa, who was working multiple jobs to support her son's medical needs while somehow still nurturing his extraordinary gifts. Tell me about your own dreams, Robert said to Lisa. Before Tommy, what did you want to do with your life? Lisa looked surprised by the question. I was in college, actually. I was studying social work because I wanted to help families navigate the healthcare system. I saw how confusing and overwhelming it could be, especially for people who were already dealing with medical crises. You didn't finish? Robert asked gently. Tommy was born during my junior year, Lisa said, without any trace of regret in her voice. His needs were so complex, and I was completely on my own. I had to choose between finishing school and taking care of my son. What about Tommy's father? Robert asked carefully. Lisa's expression grew distant. He left when the doctors explained what Tommy's condition would mean long-term. He said he hadn't signed up for a disabled child and all the challenges that would come with it. Robert felt a flash of anger at the man who had abandoned this family, but he kept his voice calm. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was, Lisa admitted. But honestly, Tommy and I are better off without someone who couldn't love him exactly as he is. We take care of each other, and we're happy. Tommy reached over and squeezed his mother's hand. We're a good team, he said with the confidence of a child who had never doubted his mother's love. Robert sat quietly for a moment, absorbing everything he had learned. Here was a family that had faced tremendous challenges with grace and determination. A mother who had sacrificed her own dreams to care for her son, and a son whose extraordinary talents were being nurtured despite seemingly impossible circumstances. Robert sat quietly for several minutes after hearing Lisa and Tommy's story, his mind working through possibilities and plans. He had built his fortune by recognizing potential where others saw problems, and right now he was looking at the most important investment opportunity of his life. Lisa, he said finally, I'd like to share something with you about why tonight has been so meaningful to me. Lisa and Tommy both looked at him with curious attention. My mother was a piano teacher, Robert began, his voice taking on a softer quality. She taught lessons in our small apartment when I was growing up. We didn't have much money, but our home was always filled with music. Students would come and go all day long, and I would sit in the kitchen doing homework while listening to scales and songs from the living room. Tommy's eyes widened with interest. Your mom taught piano? That must have been amazing. Robert smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. It was amazing, but more than that, it taught me something important. My mother believed that music had the power to change lives. She saw kids who were struggling in school suddenly find confidence when they learned to play. She watched shy children become performers and troubled teens find peace through music. That sounds wonderful, Lisa said. She must have been very special. She was, Robert agreed. But she also believed that talent like yours, Tommy, was a gift that shouldn't be wasted because of circumstances beyond anyone's control. She used to say that when you find a child with extraordinary musical ability, you have a responsibility to help that gift grow. Robert paused and looked directly at Tommy. Tommy, in all my years of attending concerts and supporting music programs, I have never heard a child play with the natural musicality you showed tonight. What you did here wasn't just impressive, it was inspiring. Tommy ducked his head. Shyly, but Lisa could see how much the praise meant to him. Now, Robert continued, I'd like to make you both an offer. But before I do, I want you to know that this isn't charity. This is an investment in talent and in the future. Lisa felt her heart start beating faster. Something in Robert's tone suggested this conversation was about to take an unexpected turn. First, Robert said, looking at Tommy, I would like to establish a full scholarship program at the conservatory downtown. It would cover not just lessons, but also practice time, recitals, competitions, and any other musical education you might want to pursue. Tommy's mouth fell open. A scholarship? For me? For you, and eventually for other children who have extraordinary talent but limited resources, Robert confirmed. I want to call it the Helen Davidson Music Foundation, after my mother. Lisa felt tears starting to form in her eyes. Robert, that's incredibly generous, but we couldn't possibly accept something so. Let me finish, Robert said gently. Because there's more, he turned to Lisa. I've been thinking about what you said about wanting to help families navigate the healthcare system. I believe that experience is exactly what other families in similar situations need. Lisa looked confused. I'm not sure I understand. I want to offer you a position as the family coordinator for the Helen Davidson Music Foundation, Robert explained. Your job would be to help identify talented children who need support, and then work with their families to access not just music education, but also the social services, medical care, and other resources they might need. Lisa stared at him in disbelief. You're offering me a job? A career, Robert corrected, with a salary that would allow you to focus on this work full-time, plus health insurance that would cover all of Tommy's medical needs without any out-of-pocket costs. The restaurant around them had grown quieter as other customers sensed something important was happening at their table. Even Frank was watching from behind the counter, clearly aware that this was no ordinary conversation. But that's not everything, Robert continued, his eyes twinkling slightly. Tommy, I noticed how much you loved playing that old piano tonight. How would you feel about having a piano of your own? Tommy looked like he couldn't breathe. My own piano? Not just any piano, Robert said. A special one designed specifically for someone with your physical needs. There are companies that make instruments adapted for people with mobility challenges. We could have one delivered to your apartment within a week. Lisa was openly crying now, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Robert was offering. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would you do all this for us? Robert's expression grew serious. Because tonight, watching Tommy play and listening to both of your stories, I remembered something my mother used to tell me. She said that when life gives you the power to change someone else's world for the better, you don't hesitate. You act. He paused and looked around the restaurant, where every customer was now openly listening to their conversation. But mostly, Robert continued, because I believe Tommy has a gift that the world needs to hear. And I believe you, Lisa. Have the experience and compassion to help other families discover and nurture their children's gifts too. Tommy had been listening to all of this with growing amazement, but suddenly he looked worried. What if I'm not good enough? What if I can't learn everything I need to know? Robert leaned forward and looked the boy directly in the eyes. Tommy, do you remember how you felt when you played that piano tonight? Tommy nodded, his face lighting up. It was the most wonderful feeling in the world. Then you're already good enough, Robert said simply. Everything else is just practice and time. Frank, who had been listening from across the restaurant, suddenly approached their table. "Mr. Davidson," he said respectfully, "I just wanted to say that what you're doing here tonight, it's incredible. And I owe this family another apology for not recognizing how special this moment was from the beginning." Robert nodded to Frank, then stood up and addressed the entire restaurant. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to ask Tommy if he would honor us with one final song tonight. Something to celebrate new beginnings." The entire restaurant erupted in applause and encouragement. Tommy looked at his mother, who was still crying but now smiling through her tears. "What do you think, sweetheart?" she asked. "One more song?" Tommy nodded eagerly and wheeled himself back to the piano. Lisa helped him transfer to the bench, and he positioned his hands over the keys. But this time, instead of a classical piece, he began to play Amazing Grace. The simple, beautiful melody filled the restaurant with a sense of hope and wonder that seemed to touch every person present. Tommy played with even more emotion than before, pouring all of his gratitude and joy into the music. As the song progressed, voices began to join in. First Mrs. Chun singing softly in her accented English. Then Mr. Peterson, his weathered voice carrying the melody with surprising strength. Soon the entire restaurant was singing along, creating a moment of pure community and celebration. When the final notes faded away, the silence lasted for several seconds before the applause began. But this time it wasn't just applause for Tommy's performance, it was applause for everything that had happened, for the generosity they had witnessed, for the reminder that extraordinary things could happen in the most ordinary places. Robert walked back to Tommy and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Tonight you've reminded me why music matters, and why helping others matters even more." Tommy looked up at him with shining eyes. "Thank you for believing in me, Mr. Robert. I promise I'll work really hard and make the most of this chance." "I know you will," Robert said. "And I can't wait to hear all the beautiful music you're going to create." As the evening wound down and customers began to leave, each one stopped by Tommy's wheelchair to offer congratulations and encouragement. The Williams family gave him their phone number and invited him to their daughter's recital. Mrs. Chun pressed a small origami crane into his hands for good luck. Mr. Peterson shook his hand formally and told him he looked forward to attending his first official concert. Lisa stood beside her son, still hardly believing that their lives had just been completely transformed by a chance encounter in a neighborhood restaurant. Tomorrow, they would wake up to a world of possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours before. But tonight, they were simply a mother and son who had shared their gifts with a room full of strangers and discovered that sometimes, when you least expect it, the world gives you exactly what you need.